Every single day, more than 2 billion people open the fridge, pull out a container of last night's dinner, and heat it up without a second thought. It feels harmless. It feels normal. Heat it until it's hot, and it's safe, right? That assumption is the reason this video exists, because it isn't always true, and the reasons why have almost nothing to do with what most people imagine. There is no dramatic warning label on your leftovers. Nothing changes color. Nothing smells different in a way you'd notice at first sniff. And yet, inside certain foods, sitting in your fridge right now, something is quietly shifting the moment you seal that container and set it on the shelf. By the end of this, you're going to look at 4 ordinary foods completely differently, and the fourth one is going to surprise you the most, because it's a food that almost everyone considers the safest, healthiest thing they could possibly eat. Before we go any further, I want to be clear about what this actually is and what it isn't. This isn't about scaring you away from your kitchen. It isn't about telling you to throw out every container in your fridge tonight. This is about closing a gap between what food safety research already shows clearly and consistently and what actually makes it into everyday conversation. Most people were never taught any of this, not in school, not from their parents, not from a cooking show. They were taught one rule, repeated endlessly: heat it until it's hot. That rule doesn't cover everything, and the gap between it and the fuller picture is exactly where a handful of ordinary, common foods quietly become more complicated than they look. Let's start with something you need to understand before any of the 4 foods make sense, because without it, everything else sounds like a scare tactic instead of what it actually is: food chemistry. When you cook something for the first time, heat does exactly what you expect. It changes texture, unlocks flavor, and makes food safe to eat by killing off the microorganisms that were living on it. That's the whole point of cooking. But food doesn't just sit there frozen in time after that first pass through the oven or the pan. The moment it starts cooling down on your counter, and especially once it's tucked into a container in your refrigerator, a second, much quieter process begins. Fats start to react with the oxygen around them. Proteins begin to change shape. And in some foods, naturally occurring bacteria that survived the initial cooking or that landed on the food afterward start multiplying slowly in the cold, biding their time. None of this is visible. None of this smells wrong. This is the part that catches people off guard again and again. Food can look, smell, and taste completely normal while these changes are already well underway. So when you take that container back out a day or two later and reheat it, you're not just warming up the same meal you made originally, you're applying heat to something that has already changed at a microscopic level. Sometimes that's totally fine. Often it's totally fine. But for a specific set of foods, this second exposure to heat interacts with what happened during storage in ways that actually matter for your health, and almost nobody talks about it in plain language. That's what this is about. 4 foods. 4 different reasons to pay attention. Stay with this to the end, because the order matters. And food number 4 is the one that catches even careful, health-conscious people off guard. The first food is one you've probably reheated more times than you can count: rice. Rice is the most widely eaten staple food on the planet. Something like 3 billion people build their meals around it, and a huge number of those people cook a big batch once and reheat portions of it across several days. It's convenient. It's cheap. It's a habit passed down through nearly every culture on Earth. And here's the twist. The danger with rice has almost nothing to do with the reheating itself. It's about what happens in the hours between the first cooking and the second. Raw rice naturally carries a bacterium called Bacillus cereus. It's not some rare contaminant that shows up occasionally. It's simply present in small amounts in the environment where rice grows. Cooking kills most of it, but not necessarily all of it, and any spores that survive can begin to germinate and multiply once the rice starts cooling. Refrigerators slow bacterial growth, they don't stop it instantly, and rice that's left out at room temperature for even a couple of hours before it goes in the fridge gives that bacterium a comfortable window to get to work. Here's the part that surprises people the most. As the bacteria multiply, some of them produce a toxin that is remarkably heat stable. That means when you reheat the rice, even thoroughly, even piping hot, You can kill the bacteria themselves, but the toxin they already released doesn't necessarily break down. It can survive the microwave, it can survive the stovetop, and if enough of it is present, it can make you seriously sick, usually within a matter of hours, with vomiting and stomach cramps that catch people completely off guard because they did everything right by reheating the food properly. This is why food safety agencies are specific and consistent about rice. Cool it quickly, refrigerate it soon after cooking, and don't let it sit around at room temperature. If you're going to reheat rice, do it once, not repeatedly, and if it's been sitting in the fridge for several days, it's genuinely safer to just let it go. This isn't about avoiding rice, it's about respecting the very narrow window where this particular staple food is vulnerable, in a way that has nothing to do with how good a cook you are and everything to do with basic bacterial biology. What makes this one worth remembering above almost everything else on this list is how deceptive it is. There's no smell that warns you. There's no visible change in texture or color. A container of rice that's been sitting out too long looks and tastes exactly like a container of rice that's perfectly fine right up until it isn't. That's precisely why the guidance around rice isn't really about the reheating step at all. By the time you're reheating it, the outcome has often already been decided by what happened hours earlier on the counter before it ever went into the fridge. Spreading rice out on a wide, shallow tray right after cooking, rather than piling it into a deep container, helps it cool faster and shrinks that vulnerable window considerably. It's a small habit, but it's the one that actually matters here. The second food is one that almost every health-conscious person leans on: chicken. It's the default lean protein. It shows up in meal prep containers, gym-goer diets, and family dinners across the world, and when there's extra, it goes straight into the fridge to be reheated later in the week. The issue with chicken isn't bacterial toxins the way it is with rice. It's about what repeated exposure to high heat does to the proteins themselves, and about the much more mundane but very real risk of foodborne illness if it isn't handled carefully. When meat is cooked at high temperatures, and especially when it's cooked, cooled, and then blasted with high heat again during reheating, certain compounds can form on the surface, particularly where the meat gets charred or very well done. These are the same kinds of compounds that form on a well-seared steak or grilled burger, and they've been studied for years in the context of long-term, frequent, high-temperature cooking, especially grilling and charring. The honest scientific picture here is nuanced. These compounds are worth knowing about if you eat a lot of very well-done or charred meat very often over years. But a single reheated chicken breast in your microwave is not the same exposure as decades of daily charcoal grilling. Where reheating chicken genuinely matters more day to day is far simpler and far more urgent: food safety. Chicken that isn't reheated to a high enough internal temperature, or that's been sitting in the danger zone between refrigerator cold and piping hot for too long, is one of the most common sources of everyday foodborne illness. Salmonella and other bacteria don't need dramatic conditions to become a problem. They need time, moderate temperature, and a little moisture, all of which a container of leftover chicken can provide if it's left out too long or reheated only partway. So the practical takeaway with chicken isn't fear of the protein itself. It's about consistency. Reheat it until it's genuinely hot all the way through, not just warm on the outside. Don't let it sit at room temperature for extended stretches before it goes back in the fridge or before you eat it again. And if you're someone who eats a lot of very charred, blackened, or heavily browned meat as a routine habit, that's worth moderating. Not because one reheated dinner is dangerous, but because the compounds involved build with frequency and degree of charring, not with an occasional microwave meal. There's also a texture problem worth mentioning, because it explains why so many people quietly avoid reheated chicken breast, even without knowing the science behind it. Chicken breast is lean, which means it has very little internal fat to protect the muscle fibers when it's exposed to heat a second time. The proteins tighten up further, moisture escapes, and what was a juicy piece of meat the night before turns dry and tough the next day. This isn't dangerous, just disappointing, and it's part of why cutting chicken into smaller pieces, adding a splash of liquid like broth or sauce, and reheating it covered and gently tends to produce a far better result than blasting a whole chicken breast on high for 2 straight minutes. Now we get to the food that surprises people the most so far, because it's one that health experts practically beg everyone to eat more of: spinach, along with other leafy greens like beet greens, celery, and Swiss chard. These vegetables are nutritional powerhouses: iron, folate, magnesium, a long list of antioxidants, and eating them fresh or freshly cooked is genuinely one of the better things you can do for your health. The complication isn't the vegetable itself, it's a specific chemical relationship these greens have with storage and time. Leafy greens like spinach are naturally high in nitrates, which is actually a good thing in their raw, natural form. Nitrates from vegetables are linked to healthy blood pressure and circulation. But once spinach is cooked and then left sitting, even in the refrigerator, naturally occurring bacteria on the surface of the leaves can begin slowly converting some of those nitrates into nitrites. This is a well-documented chemical shift, the same basic conversion involved in how cured meats are processed. On its own, this conversion isn't catastrophic. The concern shows up when those nitrites are then exposed to heat again or interact with certain compounds during digestion, creating conditions where a different class of compounds called nitrosamines can form in small amounts. Nitrosamines have a long, well-established research history connecting them to increased cancer risk when exposure is significant and sustained over time, which is exactly why food safety bodies in Europe and elsewhere have issued specific guidance about not letting cooked leafy greens sit around before reheating them. Here's the important nuance, though, because this is where a lot of health content gets sloppy. This is about accumulated, repeated exposure over a long period, not about one bowl of reheated spinach ruining your health. The actual practical risk is low for the occasional plate of reheated greens, but it's also completely avoidable, which is why it's worth knowing. If you cook a big batch of spinach, the simplest thing to do is eat what you're going to eat right away and either finish the rest cold within a few hours or just cook a fresh batch next time. Reheating spinach that's been sitting in the fridge for a day or two isn't going to hurt you in any dramatic way, but it's also not the ideal habit, and now you know exactly why. Instead of just being told to avoid it without an explanation, there's an irony sitting right in the middle of this one that's worth pausing on. Spinach is exactly the kind of food that ends up in a big batch of meal prep precisely because it's considered so healthy. Sautéed once at the start of the week, then portioned out and reheated for days. That habit, born entirely out of good intentions, is the exact pattern that gives this slow nitrate to nitrite shift the most time to happen. It doesn't mean meal prepping greens is off the table. It just means the smarter version of that habit is storing raw or lightly blanched spinach and cooking small portions fresh as you go, rather than cooking the whole batch up front and reheating it across the week. And now, the food that catches almost everyone off guard: eggs. If you had to name the safest, most universally recommended food on this entire list, eggs would probably top it. They're one of the most nutritionally complete foods that exist. Every essential amino acid, choline for brain function, selenium, antioxidants that support eye health. Doctors and dietitians recommend them constantly, and for good reason. But reheating eggs, especially scrambled eggs, omelets, or hard-boiled eggs, comes with a quality and safety issue that almost never gets discussed because eggs feel too wholesome to question. Egg yolks contain a meaningful amount of fat and cholesterol, and like any fat-containing food, that fat undergoes a natural process of oxidation the first time it's cooked. That's normal and expected. It happens with essentially every cooked food containing fat. The issue is what happens on the second pass. When a cooked egg is refrigerated and then reheated, especially at high, uneven heat like a microwave often produces, those already oxidized fats can oxidize further and faster. This can produce compounds called oxysterols, which researchers have studied for their potential inflammatory effects when consumed in significant, repeated amounts over long stretches of time. It's a real area of ongoing research, not settled or dramatic, but it is a legitimate reason eggs behave differently than people assume once they've been cooked, cooled, and reheated. There's also a more immediate and practical issue with reheated eggs that has nothing to do with long-term chemistry, texture, and digestibility. Egg proteins are delicate. When they're cooked once, cooled, and then blasted with high heat again, particularly in a microwave, which heats unevenly and creates hot spots, the proteins can become rubbery, overly dense, and genuinely harder to digest comfortably. That's why a reheated scrambled egg often tastes noticeably worse and sits heavier than a freshly made one, and it's part of why professional advice consistently leans toward eating eggs fresh rather than reheating them aggressively. If you do need to warm eggs that were made ahead of time, the better approach is gentle, low, indirect heat, a warm water bath or a low oven, rather than a quick blast in the microwave, both for how the eggs taste and for minimizing that extra round of fat oxidation. Hard-boiled eggs are actually the exception that makes this whole picture a little more forgiving. Because the yolk is sealed inside the shell during storage, it's shielded from a lot of the oxygen exposure that drives this process, which is part of why food guidance generally suggests storing hard-boiled eggs unpeeled and eating them cold rather than peeling and reheating them. Scrambled eggs and omelets don't have that protection. They're fully exposed, spread thin, and often reheated fast in a microwave, which is the exact combination that produces the driest texture and the most oxidation. If eggs are going to be part of your regular meal prep, hard-boiled and eaten cold is simply the more forgiving version of that habit than a container of reheated scramble. So here's where all four of these come together, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because the pattern is more useful than any single fact. Rice's problem is about time and bacteria before it ever gets reheated, and the fix is speed. Cool it fast, refrigerate it promptly, eat it soon. Chicken's problem is mostly about thoroughness and temperature. Reheat it fully, don't let it linger at room temperature, and go easy on the habitually charred, well-done stuff. Spinach and other leafy greens have a slow chemical shift tied to nitrates that mostly matters with frequent, repeated exposure over long periods, not the occasional bowl. And eggs are less about a hidden danger and more about a real, if modest, difference in quality and freshness once they've gone through a second round of heat. None of this means you need to throw anything out of your diet or panic about your leftovers from last night. What it means is that a few small, specific habits go a long way. Cool rice quickly and don't let it sit out. Reheat chicken until it's actually hot all the way through, not just warm around the edges. Eat leafy greens fresh when you can, and don't let cooked spinach sit in the fridge for days before microwaving it again. And when it comes to eggs, gentle heat beats a fast blast in the microwave, both for how they taste and for keeping that fat oxidation to a minimum. Investing in a simple food thermometer is one of the most underrated tools in a kitchen because it looks hot and it's actually hot enough are two very different things, especially with meat and eggs. There's one more habit that matters more than almost anything else on this list, and it's the simplest. Portion your meals so you're not creating huge amounts of leftovers that sit around for days before getting reheated over and over. The single biggest factor in almost every issue described here isn't reheating itself. It's time. Time at room temperature. Time in the fridge before that first reheat. Time between the first reheat and a second or third one. Fresh food, eaten soon after it's made, sidesteps almost every one of these concerns entirely, and that's really the whole point here. Not fear, just a clearer picture of what's actually happening in your fridge so you can make small, informed choices, instead of just assuming that hot automatically means safe. Think about someone in your life who reheats the same way most people do, without ever really thinking about it. A parent, a roommate, a college student living on meal-prepped rice and chicken, someone who microwaves eggs every morning because they made a big batch on Sunday. None of them are doing anything wrong, they just haven't had this laid out clearly before. Passing this along costs nothing and takes 10 seconds, and it might be the reason someone else finally understands why cooling rice quickly matters, or why gentle heat is better for leftover eggs than a rush blast in the microwave.